actually get them both to work.
We might.
This is exciting.
Do I have comments turned off on this though? I don't see comments on here. Okay. Looks like it's working. Okay, there we go. Perfect.
And we are live on Instagram as well. So there we go.
Awesome.
Well, hi, everybody. My name's Kristin Kirkland. I am here with my friend Bree. And Bree, what are we talking about tonight?
We are talking about the complexities of being an adoptee growing up in religious spaces.
So nice and light and fluffy topic for your Tuesday evening, but right. We're excited. We've got a lot to say about it, and it looks like TikTok can hear us both fine. Thanks for confirming, Sherry. Okay, so let's get started. Jump right into it. How was adoption like taught to you or viewed in your family growing up?
Yeah, so kind of a shift from your conversation with Lauren earlier. I was adopted when I was 15. So I have a lot of lived experience with my bio family. And what's kind of ironic is that because of all the dysfunction growing up, I actually was one of those kids that was like, I wish I was adopted. I wish I wasn't part of this family. And so, not realizing that later on I would become an adoptee and have to navigate what that actually, looks like and feels like. And, I grew up we were in my biological family, the family who would be at church on Sundays, but we weren't that was really our commitment to religion. I did go to Catholic school growing up, so I was kind of in a lot of different religious spaces. And then after I was adopted, my adoptive family was very much involved in our church. And so that was really where I got the whole experience of being an adoptee in the religious space.
Yeah. And I know we really clicked on that. And part of the reason we wanted to bring this conversation in is because we have a commonality in evangelical Christianity and how we grew up being adoptees. But so many other adoptees I've met were adopted by religious people, whether, shout out to my adoptee friends who grew up Mormon and other evangelical Christian adoptees. We've already got some comments on Instagram growing up in an evangelical Christian cult. And so with our current political climate and conversations about adoption reform becoming more popular, I love that we're going to just jump in and go there and talk about why religion complicates adoption.
Yep.
So for me, how adoption was viewed in my home growing up, I am a domestic infant adoptee through a private adoption. I grew up in the most evangelical Methodist church there ever was. Is how I describe it. It's definitely a situation where we didn't really practice Methodism the way it's intended. We were evangelical in practice, and the narratives about what it means to be adopted were deeply intertwined with saviorism narratives. And so for anyone who knows the Romans Road, that common way that people lead others to Jesus, adoption was kind of its own Romans Road for me. And I like to say that, if confessing with your mouth that Jesus is Lord is the proof in the Romans Road that change has happened and that salvation has been accepted, then for me as an adoptee, my confession was supposed to be, I'm grateful to be adopted.
Yeah.
And that's how I was a good adoptee. So
yeah,
that's kind of where we started, and some similarities, but also some differences in how we kind of came into contact with that.
Yeah. And I think something that complicated mine even more was that I was a teen mom. And so there was a lot of pressure for me to adopt my child out. And the church was a big part of that conversation too, where, how could you do this? It would, be God's will for your baby to be in a good family, to be in a family that can give your baby a better life, things that you don't have access to. That would be such a selfless thing. It would be such a loving thing that would be reflecting the image of God by blessing another family. And so those conversations were very heavy for me to carry as a teenager who was pregnant. And I wasn't adopted by that point. I was actually adopted after my oldest was about a year old. But so the church was already kind of playing a big role in my story. And just the complexity of saviorism, like you were saying. Everybody talks about how, sin and you have to be saved to not be a sinner. And what do we even consider a sin or a sinner? Because just because somebody's living differently than you doesn't mean that they're sinning or they're a sinner. And then we kind of get into those conversations about even different denominations having different understandings of what sin looks like. But why are we applying this broad stroke to so many families just because they look different? Vulnerability, families who maybe are less financially well off are immediately deemed, neglectful, or can't give you a good life, can't give you the life that you deserve. And that always opened up a lot of difficult conversations because it kind of conflicts with what we're taught in the church to kind of help bring people to, God's will, God's blessings. If you're doing the right things, God will bless you. So if you're not doing well, you're not, getting the favor of God. You must be doing something wrong. And, when you're a kid, that's so confusing. And especially when you're a kid who knows that your family doesn't necessarily come from what people deem to be a good family, that makes it even more complicated because it's like, that's my family though. And, I can't speak to being an infant adoptee, but I have heard that there's some of that shared confusion with knowing that you come from a family who would be looked down on by your church or your adoptive family, and how that really can mess with you and how you see yourself. And something that was said to me a lot is, you're going to be just like your mom. You're going to be just like your dad. And that's really difficult, knowing what my biological parents come from, which is, things like substance use issues and just a lot of really difficult things in life. And kind of being thrown into this position of needing to be the good adoptee, but then also hearing that you're going to be just like your parents if you make one mistake, if you don't do something the way that your adoptive family expects you to. It's a lot of confusion for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it adds a layer of complexity that's hard to know what to do with as a kid. And so I think those undefinable things in a childhood brain just turn into shame, at least like it did for me. Those things I didn't understand about. I can now go back and read some really excellent books about the history of child welfare in America and see that our very American tendency to make poverty an individual failure is what was breeding shame in me, hearing the church say that my biological parents were failures or sinners, et cetera, which I'm different from you because I didn't know much about them and neither did my family. So it wasn't you were going to turn out just like them. It was this innate fear of me becoming a sinner as they were assumed to be. So similar, but just like, because we didn't have details, it was made into this nebulous, fearful thing of, well, your mom was a sinner, and only based on the fact that she'd had a child when she was unmarried or that she was younger than them, which so interesting how these things wind up. Because for the record, my adoptive family was, in hindsight, I found out pretty similarly well off financially, which is to say like solidly middle class. Mm-hmm. And looking back at the paperwork I do have about my bio mom, like other than the fact that she was a single income parent, the way that she would have parented me, they made similar amounts of money, and they actually were all like claimed the same denomination within Christianity. So the fact that I was taught that my mom didn't believe in Jesus and a whole host of other problematic things that came with that, I was also taught that I wouldn't have known God if I hadn't been adopted, which is not necessarily true, because my mom said she went to church and included a specific denomination on the religion section of my paperwork. So it's really interesting how religion like adds this layer of shame to us as like the kids that grew up in that narrative, but also like puts that burden on our first families too.
Yeah. Well, and I think for me, like my biological family actually were pretty well off. So I wasn't necessarily coming from, a lower income family. Both my maternal and paternal families were, fairly wealthy. It was more of like my biological parents, like who were the people who were, young parents. They were both around 18 when they had me, struggling with substance use issues, all of those things. And unfortunately, very heavily enabled. And so that was more of the dynamic for me. But because I then became a teen mom myself, that same like stigma was placed on me. And we, like I said, we know what the church kind of teaches about families who don't necessarily fit that mold of what a good family or a godly person or, you know, whatever looks like. And so that was also kind of difficult too, because materialistically, I had a pretty good life with my biological family. It was more of that emotional and like safety aspect for me. And I think that people get really mixed up about that because money does not mean better. And I know that that's said a lot in, you know, adoptee spaces to kind of explain that wealthy people don't necessarily make better parents. They don't necessarily make better families. And it kind of goes into that different doesn't mean better conversation. Because I actually had access to a lot of things that people who aren't adopted don't have access to. You know, I was given a lot of opportunities with my biological family, but again, I was not protected or kept safe. And so that was really the piece that contributed to my adoption and why I became adopted. And so, you know, I think people don't really know what to do with stories that don't fit the mold that they're told in church about what an orphan looks like or an adoptee. And I think that's why these conversations are so important, because when you start talking about the realities of what adoption really is and what it means to the people who are adopted, people are completely shocked because they've never heard it said this way before. And that's because it doesn't fit that propaganda that places like churches try to, you know, tell people to get them all riled up to do this one thing and ignore the reality of it, really.
Absolutely. If you don't mind, I'd love to say a little more about that together, because I know something you and I share is that the Christian spaces we were in very much used us to tell their version of our story as if, like, oh, look, this adopted person agrees that what we did was really great. It's like Regina George. Oh, so you agree? You're really pretty.
Yeah.
So we were both kind of used in that way. So I'd love, if you don't mind, to talk a little more about what that was like and what things did they ask you to say and in what setting.
Yeah, so I'll unpack a little bit here, but so like I said, my adoptive family were very heavily involved in our local church. And so they were on like the pastoral teams, they were very public facing in their roles in the church, which meant so were we. And one of the things that my adoptive parents did, they hosted a foster and adoptive support group through the church. And I just became kind of the poster child of that. And I was, you know, expected to give my testimony at all of these meetings and tell these hopeful foster and adoptive parents how great my experience was and how grateful I was and how lucky I was to be saved from this awful situation I was in, which objectively I was in a pretty rough situation with my biological family. However, that part should have been taken into consideration when asking me to share all of those vulnerabilities with these people who really didn't deserve and were not entitled to those parts of my story. But my adoption was actually very publicized locally. It was in our newspaper. There was a whole like story done about it. And so even to this day, like you can Google my name and my adoption story pops up. And that's actually a point of contention that I've had with my adoptive family and really my adoptive mom, because, you know, at the time I was 15 and I had this idea of, you know, you get to pick what you want, but also no, you don't really have options. So you have this choice and you could choose something else, but you actually really can't choose something else. So what do? You just kind of throw yourself all into this role that you're expected to fill and do it happily and do it, you know, in a way that tells everybody that this is a good thing and that your adoptive family really is saving you. And you're so grateful to be there. And that was, it's just so damaging because it gives everybody else the wrong idea about what's really happening for the child. And it's telling other people that, yeah, you should be, you know, encouraged to go and do this for other kids. There's other kids that can be just like this and be shouting your praises to the next family who might be looking to foster or adopt. And I know that there's some controversy with the foster care piece, but I actually think there's a lot of crossover in these conversations because I was adopted from foster care, although mine was a little bit different in that the family, I knew them before entering foster care. Um, but I think like there's still a lot of those same pieces with the financial incentivization of adopting out of foster care, a lot of mistreatment of foster kids, especially when you kind of go a different path than what your foster parents think you should, or there's just a lot of moving pieces, and church was a big part of all of those things when everybody's like, oh, you're making the best decision, oh, you're going to have the best home, oh, you must just be so lucky and so grateful that you have this family who's willing to take you and your baby in. And just a lot of like that backhanded shame where it's like they're presenting it to you as this wonderful thing, but like you hear what they're actually telling you underneath it.
Yeah. And being a big fan of someone, or being someone who's a big fan of like putting a name to what's going on there, I hear echoes in your story that are in mine too, of prosperity gospel being an excuse for coercive control.
Mm-hmm.
So like if we believe a prosperity gospel that we do these things or we behave this way or we fit this certain mold that people say is favored by God, whatever the like mainstream is in that situation. So like in evangelicalism, white, straight, married,
Yep.
Rich,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The prosperity gospel is the excuse to coerce people to fitting that mold because you've got to fit that mold in order to experience salvation or heaven or these other good things that supposedly are supposed to come from religion, right?
Yep.
So I see echoes of that prosperity gospel being the excuse for coercive control for me too. I know that there were times where I got up as the lay speaker in our church and told my adoption story as a sermon as a child. And I'm certain that I was asked, like, is this something you really want to talk about? I think partially because my adoptive parents didn't want people to know. They wanted to pretend that with the same race adoption that I was fully theirs.
Yeah.
But also I think there was like a level of they didn't want to feel like they were forcing me to see things that way, maybe. But I very much picked up the message that that's what you're supposed to say. Like if adoption is like salvation and adoption happened to me and we're supposed to talk about our salvation because we're grateful to Jesus for saving us, then I've got to talk about adoption the same way. And so I remember sharing it in churches. I remember in medical school, which I very much did thanks to coercive control related to my adoption story, which I can explain in a second. But I gave a talk to the Students for Life, Medical Students for Life group, and I gave a talk about adoption. And it was my idea to bring in the family doctor who arranged my adoption, who was my doctor throughout childhood and then my mentor in medical school. And we together gave a talk about how you can help patients choose life. And it's a level of brainwash that we adoptees call the fog.
Yeah.
I was very much in the fog and was proselytizing to everybody about how great adoption is and how it saved me.
Yep. Yeah, I definitely relate to that. And I think we also have to talk about then that mirror image of how in church they preach about Jesus is your savior, and you have to, depending on the church, some churches say you don't have to do anything but have faith and you don't have to do good works necessarily to be saved by Jesus. Other churches really push like you have to live in this godly way and here's all the things you have to do to be saved, depending on the church. But most of them still have that same idea of to be saved, here's what your life needs to look like to show that you are saved. So then when we're kind of painting the picture of adoptive parents being the saviors, what does that model tell us if you've grown up in the church where this is the model? Jesus is the savior. Here's you down here making all these mistakes. Everything you do is bad. And here's how you make it right. We're also placing adoptive parents on that same pedestal, and the kids working from the framework that religion gives them, that savior is here, you're down here. Here's what you need to do to show that you're worthy of being saved or that you are saved. And it kind of forces children in the religious space who are adopted to kind of fall in line with that same idea of like, you need to do all these things to prove that you're worthy of being saved or to demonstrate that you're grateful for being saved. And it kind of goes into that whole idea of, should we really be forcing kids to be grateful and performing to show that they deserve to have a family and to have permanency, and also not telling them the full story about how that came to be for them. So I think there's a lot of really long conversations we could have about even just that part of religion and how it relates to adoptees in the religious space.
I think it definitely, that prosperity gospel, coercive control, and then that layer of assimilation, that's just part of a lot of the ways that we practice Christianity in this country right now. And I'm speaking very broadly, and I know that, but I think there's a lot of coercive control to our faith spaces in general. And so then to add, adoptee gratitude and falling in line, assimilation, and being a sign of, salvation, like that can be super harmful. I know one of the biggest things I've had to unpack in adulthood as I kind of deconstruct adoption, deconstruct the faith stuff, has been related to gratitude. Because, if God loves a cheerful giver, but I'm giving my gratitude compulsively in order to gain safety or to people please, is that genuine gratitude? I don't think it is. So in asking for the performance of gratitude, we're actually not seeing real gratitude or any of the benefits of what gratitude can bring us anyway.
Right. And at least from my understanding of those things in the religious space, is that then that means there's something in you that you need to go and figure out what that is and how that needs to change, and not necessarily something that's wrong with the system around you, but you're actually the problem. And I think that's super harmful, because we're placing even more pressure on a child really to manage all of their feelings and not even giving them the space to authentically process it. Because again, it's something within you. You need to change your heart. You need to go and do some self-reflection and figure out what it is in you that's not lining with, God's plan or God's will for your life. And that's a lot to put on a kid, especially a kid in a situation where they're carrying so many heavy things. And if we add on that layer of maybe their family doesn't allow them to process those things outwardly or talk about them or even acknowledge them, that's just compounding all of the things that they're having to sit with.
Yeah. Do you feel like you had moments of behavioral correction that ended with this whole idea of you need to assimilate and be grateful?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had moments of, I'll call it acting out, but it was grief, kind of escaping, right? Like disenfranchised grief comes out somewhere, and sometimes it's in, behaviors we can't quite control. And I know for me, the correction was very Dobsonian, that he always needed to come back and create relational repair. But for us, relational repair was always very much a call to me to be grateful, to assimilate, not to ask questions, not to have doubts. And anytime I doubted what adoption meant to me, I was doubting my faith. So that's very much how that repair was made after discipline for us in that Dobson model, with adoption as an added element.
Yeah, and that's really hard too, just because now I have clinical training in attachment and family systems. And so now I'm able to kind of put the language to those experiences. And, if we talk about how every time a child has a difficult time, they're punished for it. And then the repair conversation is them having to feel shame and guilt over expressing a raw emotion that they're not able to process. What kind of complex are we building in that child to think about themselves, their feelings, their experiences? That's altering the way that that child is going to grow up for the rest of their lives. And that's why we see so many adoptees who do come out of that fog and they're like completely disoriented, because they're like, wait a minute, those were just feelings that I was having. I wasn't the only one. So that can't be that there was something wrong with me. There was actually something wrong with the environment I was growing up in and not being supported to, process my experiences in a real way. And I think that's really unfair for adoptees, honestly, because in any other situation that I can think of anyway, if a child is struggling, we would send them to get therapy. We would send them to clinicians or professionals who can help them process that. But if it's about adoption, no, we can't have that, because that goes against the narrative that the adoption was a good thing, that this is a 100% good thing. The child benefits and has no negative side effects from it, if you will. And so I think that does further damage, because, we already have such a lack of competent adoptee centered therapists. And I think that if more people were sharing how much help they need when it comes to having children who are not with their biological families, that it would be a bigger topic of, hey, we really need to make these curriculums center adoption way more than they do right now. And, hopefully eventually it doesn't have to be necessarily adoption, but maybe just like permanency competent therapy. But that's a whole other conversation.
Guardianship competent, right?
Right. Yeah.
PSA for those listening who may not know, the difference between adoption and guardianship is one of the primary differences is that adoptees retain access and the legality of their original birth certificate and identity. So adoption as a legal entity means that the original birth certificate is nullified and changed into a new one. Like that's what adoption is by definition of the law. So guardianship allows you to keep access to that, which is great.
Yeah.
So let's go into like, how did we get here type of conversation a little bit of what, like, how did we get to this point where, and this is such a huge topic. So we're going to skim the surface here of why is it that churches seem to be some of the people who tout and glorify adoption or participate in it the most. And like, what is that based in scripturally from what you were taught?
Yeah. So I think the biggest issue for me when it comes to what churches share about adoption and why, it's such a big ministry in so many churches, is because it really bothers me when we use the language that someone was called to adopt. Because if we really dissect that, what you're saying is you're called to celebrate the fact that a family has failed. And that's very problematic. Why is nobody ever called to adopt a family? Why is nobody ever called to support a family? Why is nobody called to adopt, and I use adopt more as like a metaphor for caring for somebody versus the actual legal process. But, caring for single mothers who need that support. Why are we just called to take their baby from them, but not ever to just keep their baby with them and support them? If you have the resources to take that baby from them, why can't we use those resources for that baby to stay with their mother or their family? And, that's something that's really hard for me to kind of make sense of, just because I do have that experience of being both an adoptee and then also pressured to adopt. And while I didn't choose adoption for my child, my entire pregnancy, I was really struggling with that decision because of the pressure that the church put on me. And, I think that's why we see so many ties between churches and Christian agencies for adoption. One of the only actual agency that approached me was Bethany Christian Services. Mm-hmm. And I got the same speech that I think everybody else who has dealt with them has, where it's like, you get to have this open adoption. You get to be the driver in the driver's seat. You can decide what this looks like. And you also get to know that you made the best choice because your child can have this great life with a family who's been praying for a baby. And you get to fulfill that prayer for them. And, I don't think that there's any true scripture that proposes that as a solution. Okay. I think like with lots of other things, people interpret it the way that makes sense for them, because if we can tie a business to our ministry, well, let's do that. That's an easy way to make money. And unfortunately, the product happens to be humans and babies. And I think that that's where it just gets so problematic. And we have to then dissect the language that's used in churches and in scriptures and the way people are interpreting it. Because I personally have not ever been able to find somewhere where that justifies what is happening.
Yeah, it's not there at all. A big part of the research I've been doing that we talked about for my book has been trying to dive into those parts of scripture and say, like, how did we get to using these to justify what modern adoption is? And is at the time when I dove into this first, is my hunch correct that these are not like faithful interpretations of those parts of scripture?
Yeah.
And I sought out biblical scholars who are experts in that word as it is translated in the New Testament, adoption. Mm-hmm. It shows up just 5 times in the New Testament. As far as we know, they were all uses. The word was pretty much only used by Paul. Now there's at least one of those letters of Paul that's contested as to whether he even wrote it. But every time that word is used, it's meant to be a metaphor for something else. So at the very least, like what we do know from biblical scholars whose entire job it is to study this, is that he keeps using that word, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. To quote Princess Wright a little bit. The other thing that I have discovered that was really validating is that James 1:27 is not a call to care for widows and orphans by separating them, but rather by keeping them unified as a dyad, as a sacred unit. Which, to what you were talking about, like, why is it that we interpret scripture in such a way that means, well, the way that we save a child is by separating from their family? That is certainly not scriptural, but we have an entire Sunday every November that used to be called Orphan Sunday and is now called Pure Religion Sunday, based on that verse in James, where we celebrate adoption as a picture of the gospel. And that's just it's not scripturally faithful. It doesn't take historical context into account, and it's certainly not fair to adoptees or to our families.
Right. Yeah. And I think another piece of that too is part of it comes with the whole idea that we need to make disciples of everybody. And I think it's a lot easier for people to make disciples out of a baby that they believe to be a blank slate than it would be to convince a family unit to, follow this religion or this idea. And so I think it also helps their numbers a little bit to say, oh, I'm a fisher of men because I've got all these people that are disciples now because this family adopted and this family adopted, and I was able to, baptize their adopted child or whatever. So I think there's a lot of pieces of religion that we see throughout adoption and the adoption narrative that really we've all come to just kind of accept. And it's definitely problematic. And I think part of it too is just that like white saviorism where you don't get the same celebration if you are supporting a family, because nobody can see you carrying around this baby and say, oh my gosh, you're so amazing for taking that baby. That baby is so lucky to have you. You don't get that same thing when the mother's raising their baby and you're providing support. Although I think the latter is a lot more to be celebrated than to take a baby from, their mother. But a lot of people don't see it that way. And I think that's also part of why the church pushes that as a ministry, is because it makes you feel good. You feel much more fulfilled to say that you get to take care of this baby and you get to do all this hard work and, parent this child that wasn't actually yours. But you feel good for doing it. And you have that like tangible reward of this child indefinitely giving you their gratitude for doing it. And that might not be the case if you were to help support a mother or a family, because maybe they aren't always going to show that they're grateful for some of the support that you've given them. But that has to be okay. Just like if you are going to adopt a child, it has to be okay that maybe someday they're never going to want to talk to you again. Maybe they're not ever going to feel grateful for you raising them. And that's okay, because that shouldn't have ever been what it was about.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's interesting that so much of this coincides with what we're seeing in our cultural moment politically. And I'm sure a lot of people would tell me not to get political, but I'm going to, because Christianity in our country has been highly politicized, and the name of Jesus has been co-opted to justify a lot of abuse and control and some injustice happening. So I think I'm going to say this pretty directly. The churches in America right now, like broadly, have, as you said, a white saviorism problem. And beneath that, we have a litany of problems that are all tied to white saviorism and to colonialism. And we have come to believe that the way of Jesus would be to get something out of serving someone else, would be to take and have this proof of what a good person I am because I raised this kid, or look, I'm colorblind, I'm raising a child of another race than mine, or like there's all kinds of like selfish motives that even if on the surface your intent wasn't to do those things, inherently the system is abusive. So participating in it is causing harm. And the system is rooted in all these things that, because we are also having a literacy problem in our country, and the fact that a lot of us don't know the true history of America. We weren't taught it. We aren't incentivized to learn it or go dig into it. We miss a lot of the nuance that's very present in our cultural narratives. And now we don't know that it's there or why. So villainizing people who are impoverished and not seeing poverty as a systemic issue that leads to coercion and relinquishment, for example. A lot of the problems with racism in the child welfare system, if anybody wants to be very enlightened, I love the book The Sun Won't Come Out Tomorrow by Kristin Martin, who highlights the history of orphanhood in America. And she points out that orphanhood is very much an Americanized trope now, because we see the orphan, or the adoptee who we've created to be an orphan, as kind of a symbol of the American pluck and spunkiness and what Americans can achieve if we just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And so we're keeping people oppressed to continue this false narrative of American exceptionalism, and to allow us to like maintain the status quo of racism and white saviorism in our country.
Which that's a really great example of why the adoption narrative gets so much backlash publicly now, is because that same idea that it's easier to just continue with the system the way that it is, because it's harder to challenge what we've been led to believe for our entire lives, and to face the reality that this is actually causing a lot of people harm. It's easier to just no, we're not going to talk about that, because look at all these happy adoptees. You know, they're the proof that actually it is a good thing, and you're just making up your own story because you're mad about something. And so, yeah, that was a really great example of like a larger version of what adoptees face when they talk about the reality of adoption, because it goes against what everybody's been told adoption is.
Absolutely. And I find it really hard to find like the right balance of like being as provocative as I need to be to point out some of these things that we don't think about, because we should be shocked, and we should have a moment of realizing, oh wow, a lot of things need to change, and we're doing things in a way that it's not really reflective of what we intend it to be, right? Like we need to have some provocative discussions about it, but also like I carry some nuance and some compassion for the fact that like the industry has sold a lie to everyone involved in adoption. And I know I've said this once tonight for those of you who joined the earlier live, but I do have compassion for everyone involved, because the industry really is if we got to pick a villain here, the complex backstory that has gotten us here is what we need to kind of come up against all together. So no one is calling Christians evil here. No one is calling adoptive parents evil here, you know, but the things that we're upholding in the name of faith or in the name of child welfare are not good things. And so those are the things we need to come up and treat as our opponent, if there has to be an opponent here.
Right. And I think that it should be made clear too, that once you're made aware of these realities and you are some part of this constellation, you become complicit when you refuse to listen, and when you refuse to learn, and when you refuse to find a way to do better. Because, you know, there's so many adoptive parents who probably did mean well, but when they're faced with this reality, they're not willing to hear their part in that, even if it wasn't intentional. And that's very damaging, not only to the children that they've adopted, but to all adoptees, because they then go on to share their narrative and their perspective with other people who might be adoptive parents or looking to become adoptive parents. And instead of providing the truth and the reality to those people, it's just like playing telephone with something that is not actually based in fact, and it's not based in the real experiences of adoptees. And so they become a complicit part of harming children who are a part of this system.
I don't know. I'm curious to see if this is similar for you. So I moved around a lot because of medical training and was in several different churches, and I was kind of seeking out different denominations to see what was what and exploring for a while there. But in nearly every church that I participated in, and granted, I was choosing mostly evangelical-esque churches because that's what was familiar to me. I don't know that I tried orthodoxy or anything too mainline beyond, I was raised Methodist. But in almost every church I participated in, there was a foster adopt ministry, but within the barriers and bounds of that, it was mostly accomplishing what you just described, of kind of upholding the societal narrative, glorifying the act of adoption as, you know, something saint-like, and not really considering the children involved, because the assumption was that they were all okay. Is that kind of your experience too?
Yeah. And I wasn't super privy to those kinds of ministries before I became a part of the foster system. Because growing up, my biological family was more Lutheran. And then, like I said, I also went to Catholic school until 5th grade. So I was kind of exposed to a lot of different denominations. And then ultimately my adoptive family was more of like the non-denominational, but participated in several different churches. And it was really the non-denominational churches where I was exposed to just how huge this foster adoptive ministry really is. You know, I can think of off the top of my head at least 15 families who have internationally adopted. You know, the reason actually how I became adopted by the family I was because my biological grandma had been calling around to churches asking if there were any families who wanted to take siblings. And that was how we ended up getting connected. They were strangers, but because they were in a church and had expressed interest in taking children in at some point, that's how we ended up, you know, becoming adopted eventually. So I think people have come to assume that church and adoption also go together. Like if you're looking for a place to either adopt out a child or to get a child, like church is where you go to find that process. And so, yeah, I think that that's definitely one of those things. And I can't think of a conversation that I've ever heard in church where it asks about the child's experience, unless it's asking for their positive testimony. I don't think I've ever heard a testimony that speaks poorly about adoption. I think that the testimony is usually based on all the bad things that led up to their adoption. And now their adoption is like this light bulb moment where everything clicked together and everything was fixed and solved, and they were able to love themselves and love other people and experience love. And, you know, it's
unicorns and rainbow farts.
Right. And, and even if you had a good experience with adoption, that's just not reality, because if you think about the process of adoption, there's so much grief and loss that comes with that. And that's okay that you love your adoptive family, and it's okay that you had a good experience, but it's also okay, and I would argue very important for you to sit with the grief and the loss that comes with that, because otherwise you're just gaslighting yourself and you're not allowing yourself to kind of fully experience the weight of your story, really.
Yeah. Listen, y'all, like the Bible says that Jesus is close to the brokenhearted. Not that Jesus asks the brokenhearted to be quiet and be grateful. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think we can do much better in faith spaces at embracing lament. I love Latasha Morrison's book, Be the Bridge, and she talks a lot about lament as it pertains to racial reconciliation. That's where I started to learn about what real lament was, and I think that helped me on a personal level, both in racial reconciliation efforts and unlocking a little bit of that disenfranchised grief in myself to really access like the gift of like experiencing and working through the grief rather than just pretending it doesn't exist. So weirdly, churches are not a place where we are comfortable with loss or lament, and churches should be the place to go to do that and to get support in it.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, that ambiguous loss where, you know, you've experienced a loss, but there's not necessarily like a concrete way to express that loss, like especially with biological family, for, you know, an infant adoptee who's never maybe met their biological family, but you know that there's a loss there, and because there's no funeral, there's no concreteness to that loss, it's just kind of a thing that sits in you. And how do you even deal with that unless you have somebody who's competent enough to sit with you in that and say, yeah, this sucks, it's probably not ever going to go away, but here's how we can keep talking about it. Here's how we can honor that. And the church, I think, does the opposite and tends to say, no. That's something that you need to go work out in yourself. You actually didn't lose anything. Look at all the things that you've gained. And, you know, one of the most harmful things I think I heard after becoming adopted was, well, don't think of it as a loss. You didn't lose your family. You gained this family, and now you've also been welcomed into the family of God and, you know, our church family. And it's like, that doesn't replace the things that I've lost. And it's okay that I lost them. It hurts. And I know that I am safer physically now not being in that environment, but that's still my family. That was still my home. Those are still the people that I come from. And I think that it's well-intentioned, but I'm actually going to be making a post about this soon, where that toxic positivity in adoptee spaces, and especially in churches too, I think they're really guilty of this. Not everything needs to be spun in a positive way. It's okay that people have negative feelings. And I hesitate to even say negative feelings, because what really is a negative feeling? It's just a feeling. It's something that we all experience at some point, and that's part of being a human being.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think we've identified, in the interest of showing like not just missed opportunities, but opportunities for reparations and reform, right? Like two things that we can be doing better in our faith spaces are embracing lament and helping to walk alongside people through grief, and also to be having important conversations about whether child welfare is accomplishing what it could or if there are better ways. And I think partially because churches have been such a big part of the problem, but also partially because churches are well resourced to do these things. I think churches could be leaders in family preservation efforts. And
Yeah.
I think churches could be leaders in helping adoptees navigate grief, or
Hmm.
helping anyone navigate grief and loss. But it's just,
Right.
we're so hung up on looking a certain way to please that prosperity gospel narrative that we're missing opportunities to love people, I think, the way Christ taught us to love, from
Yeah.
my reading and understanding of the Bible.
I agree. And I think one thing too that the church could be doing better in supporting people who are dealing with all of these complex issues is referring out to people who are actually competent in it. We don't need to, disciple somebody who is in the midst of a really big crisis. And I'm going to call it a crisis because people who are adopted, who finally come to terms with the reality of everything that they've been carrying, they don't need somebody to tell them to just leave it at the feet of Jesus. They need somebody
Yeah,
who
no.
is clinically trained to sit with them and process the trauma, the grief, the even happiness. There's a lot of complex feelings, and it needs to be okay to refer to people who are outside of that faith community who can provide that actual evidence-based support that people need. And that doesn't mean that they're going to turn away from their faith because they went to a therapist, but it needs to be a collaborative effort to support people. You can support their spiritual journey in the church, but you also need to provide them with adequate resources to support them in their mental health and their emotional processing journey
Yes.
too.
And clinical experts with degrees, not pastors who want to sit down
Oh
and
my gosh, I could go on
give you
about that
advice.
because
Yes.
I've encountered several because of how ingrained my adoptive family was in the church, and it was much more harmful, fed a lot of information back to my adoptive family, which then in turn produced consequences in my adoptive home afterwards. And, unfortunately, that same pastoral counselor is no longer able to practice because of some charges that happened with minor clients, like we unfortunately have heard way too much of in that kind of space. And so I think there's just a lot of things that the church can be doing better to support people who are vulnerable. And I think the adoptee population is a vulnerable population because of the narrative that society has about adoption. And if anybody were to speak out opposite of that narrative, it becomes kind of an isolating experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious about a phenomenon I sort of noticed coming out of the fog, and I want to know, like, if you experienced this too. So, like, kind of deconstructing the complexity of all of these narratives coming at me about what it meant to be a member of the church and saved, and which family is the family of God to me, and whose voice is the voice I need to be listening to, and all these things I'm reckoning with, right? I started to notice that, like, at least in the churches I've been part of, adoptees are kind of like simultaneously tokenized and also forgotten. And also, on top of that, simultaneously infantilized and parentified. Meaning, like, no one wants to hear the real human, like, story of what we go through as adoptees, but everyone wants to hear the propagandized version, right? And so we're like pedestaled for that, but like who we really are is kind of just like erased. Like, okay, go be in the corner. Like, we don't want to hear about your struggles with being adoption. We just want to hear how great we are for doing it, right? But also with that, like, we have these foster adopt ministries, and we support parents who foster and adopt, and we think that by supporting adoptive parents that we're supporting children involved.
Mhm.
But then we totally forget that adoption is something that you carry with you throughout your life. And so the phenomenon I'm like getting to here is that in the church I was in at the time I came out of the fog, and where I needed the support we were just talking about, like, I did try to seek it out, and I tried to come and talk to the elders about a particular prayer that was said on Orphan Sunday that was very triggering to me. And like, hey, there's a whole population of people who are in our church that are adopted and have this context that I come from that we're not honoring when we pray that God would put kids in good Christian families.
Yeah.
So did you experience that kind of simultaneous tokenization, pedestaled, and the infantilization, parentification thing too?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's an extension of what the church teaches about parenting in general, too.
Yeah.
Children are kind of seen as property. They're seen as something that parents own and kind of lord over, if that makes sense, where,
Mm-hmm.
you're meant to correct them, to mold them into this person that is supposedly, godly, which doesn't leave a lot of room for being an individual and for having autonomy.
For
And I think,
humanity. Yeah.
right. And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of an extension of that, but then even more so on adoptees, because now you have this added layer of you have to be grateful because we didn't have to bring you into our family. You could have been in a dumpster, in foster care, on someone's doorstep, like all of the supposed alternatives that adoptees have.
Those
But
are so evidence-based.
right, happens all the time. um, but yeah, so you have this level of gratefulness that you have to have because you have this saviorism piece that biological kids don't even have in religious spaces. And so I think it's an extension of that. And then also adoptees are just kind of seen as this like caricature of a person. Like you're not seen as an individual. An adoptee is like one mold, everybody gets pushed through that, and if you don't fit into that mold, then what do we do with you? And instead of figuring out that, hey, adoptee is just one facet of an individual's identity, no, that's going to be your whole label. That's who you are, and everything else about you falls underneath that label. And so as far as like the infantilization parentification thing, I think for me, when I speak about that, it's a little bit different just because I was a teenager and I was also a teen mom. And so the way that I felt kind of infantilized versus parentified is that I was expected to do all of the caretaking and cleaning and caring for the house, but at the same time, like I wasn't trusted to like have friends and go out and do things unless I was under the surveillance of somebody that was trusted. And so it's kind of like that weird dichotomy of like, what do you actually think of me? Like, do you trust me to do all of these tasks that I never had experience doing, but now that I'm here, I'm expected to know how to do all of it perfectly? Or do you see me as somebody who needs to be under surveillance because I'm not trusted to make good decisions and do things the right way? So definitely a lot of that in my situation. And then like the tokenization, yeah, I think for me it was really just more of like I was always a reflection of the sacrifices that my adoptive family made. So everywhere I went, I was expected to be reflective of this sacrificial choice, and I needed to represent that was a good decision, and that the payoff was worth it. That yeah, they were a better choice for me. They were a better family for me. I'm living the best life and making the best choices, and it's all thanks to them adopting me. So I don't know how that lines up with your experience, but I know mine's a little bit different just because I had a lot of life experience before becoming an adoptee.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I can see how that played into your story in a different way, but still like had a similar impact. It sounds like.
Yeah.
I know my biggest thing when I came to those church elders, and really it was interesting. And I'll tell the story so there's good context. But I was part of the worship team at this church I was in. I had been kind of deconstructing without knowing that's what was going on. There was no way for me to deconstruct adoption without deconstructing faith, and vice versa. They were so like deeply entwined. I call it a double deconstruction just because that's what happened to me. So I'm like quietly going through that. I don't really know that's what's going on, but I'm like beginning to question, like, are there things about being adopted that are maybe causing this inner ache that I feel like I'm never right or complete or whole or whatever. And it's Orphan Sunday. I go up. There's an elder who comes and does what was called a kingdom prayer, where we pray as a congregation about something. And of course, on theme for Orphan Sunday, they pray. And as I've said before tonight, they prayed specifically asking that parental rights would be terminated by the courts with ease so that these children could stay in their good Christian homes that we were giving them, because aren't we great?
Yeah.
And because I've been questioning like the circumstances that led to my life being the way it was, and thinking a lot about my bio mom, who unfortunately I will never get to meet. She passed when I was little, but wondering about who she was, and how our life might have been, or whatever. Like figuring out for myself what adoption meant. To hear that was very triggering for me, and I had a visceral reaction, and decided later, like after I had a chance to kind of reckon with what had happened, that I really wanted to talk to somebody about the fact that I think we're overlooking an entire group of people in our church that maybe need care in a different way than the average churchgoer, or like just, I don't know, some sensitivity with the unique circumstances, right?
Yeah.
And so I asked to speak with the elders, and I got sent to the one elder who had adopted kids, because he would understand.
Oh no.
In a way that the others wouldn't. So that was disappointing. But we had a conversation, and I wish I was who I am today, where I have looked at the research and the data, and I've had time to learn from other adoptees and the literature we do have. But with the paltry kind of feeble feet that I had at the time, I tried to explain, like, this is what's going on for me. This is what, I feel like was communicated. And I feel like it was really hurtful to say that, one family deserves to raise a child and one doesn't. And like to say all of these very heavy things, all these heavy implications about identity and whatnot. And I remember the response being, well, what is it you want me to tell people? Because I always tell people that every Christian should adopt, because that's our call from Scripture, because Christ adopted us into the family of God. And it was like an inner moment where I just was like beating my head against a wall, because this narrative is so pervasive, and I didn't know how to come up against it at the time. But I think it's interesting to kind of see how similar our experiences have been, because one of the most loving things I think churches can do for adult adoptees is to remember that it wasn't a one-time event for us.
Right.
And that perspective, even if we don't realize it, paints our personal theology and how we encounter our identity and what it means to be a churchgoer or believer. Like that's all through a lens that we're ignoring and we're pretending doesn't exist. And I think that's causing some harm.
Right. Well, and even if you look at the language that's used in the church versus adoption, chosen, wanted, saved, all of these words mean something. And, we're giving them so much weight in the church, and people are just using them almost as weapons against adoptees to kind of guilt you or shame you back into your place. And to remember that, like, well, you were chosen because somebody didn't want you. And I think that does absolutely really mess with your identity and mess with you for really forever. That causes you to have to deconstruct that over and over and over again throughout your life. Because for me personally, and also just in my little bit of work with clients, your identity is something that you're constantly deconstructing and rebuilding throughout your life. You go through so many different versions of yourself. And when you add on this very complex identity experience like adoption, you're constantly having to reorganize how you understand that part of your experience, and then like making it make sense in the context of whatever stage of life you're in. Hopefully that made sense. But like what I mean by that, for me anyway, is, so I had my experience with my biological family. And then once I became an adoptee, I had this whole other experience, and the church kind of made me believe about myself that, well, I should be grateful now because I'm wanted by this family. I'm now a part of, the church, and they wanted me like Jesus wants all of his people, right? Now that I'm kind of not a part of the church like I was growing up, and I'm also not really a part of my adoptive family either anymore like I was growing up, you kind of have to like, you're constantly looking back through a different lens of like your experiences. And it's almost like you're judging yourself through different lenses over and over to kind of be like, wow, I wish I would have did this differently now that I know this. Or, I'm dealing with this situation now. How do I make sense of that because of all these experiences where I was told I wasn't wanted or I was chosen? I don't really feel chosen right now by my adoptive family. So what does that mean about when somebody told me that I was chosen? Was I actually chosen then, or was I just kind of a placeholder? Hopefully that makes sense. I'm kind of rambling about that, but
no, you make a good point that we use words, phrases, terms, metaphors without really knowing what we're communicating. I think it is like spiritual truths.
yeah,
And you cannot use adoption as a metaphor in our modern day and age without considering what modern adoption actually accomplishes. But I
yeah,
think that's what we try to do, because scripture says adoption, so adoption must be this like symbol of what we
right.
believe, and then you're forcing people into a mold, and you're forcing people to believe certain things about themselves to uphold like the status quo, and we're doing harm that we don't see. And I would think
Yeah,
that someone who sees other humans as the image of God, which means precious and unique and loved and worthy of dignity and consideration, like would not want that to continue, even unintentionally.
hmm yeah. And I think, being able to sit with that kind of tells me what kind of character you have and how you're actually showing up in, the identity, whether you're a part of the church or not. Can you sit with somebody who is telling you that something you're preaching or doing is harmful? Or are you going to try to silence them because that would cause you to feel uncomfortable and you want them to
Mhm,
feel uncomfortable instead?
mhm,
I think that's something that a lot of people in the church struggle with because they want to kind of have this comfortable identity being a Christian and sitting in the auditorium every Sunday at church or whatever, and that kind of goes into like the idea of masking a little bit too. Is like the people that we see sitting in church aren't always the same people when we go back home, and that's
mhm,
really difficult to sit with as an adoptee because like in my adoptive family we were one way in church, and then when we were home it was a totally different story. But
us too. Yeah.
I was expected to be the same person everywhere. I wasn't
Yeah.
allowed to let that mask fall. I had to perform that okayness everywhere. I
Mhm,
had to constantly be that visual representation, that validation that they made the right choice adopting me. Even though I could see my adoptive parents sitting in church, preaching, praying over people, being pastoral leaders, and then we're at home and you guys can't get it together. But if I, am having a rough day or struggling with something like that, that must mean that I need to have some serious discipline. I need to have more surveillance. I need to be isolated more. That was a reflection of something I was doing wrong. But for them, that's just normal.
mhm.
So that was something that was really hard for me.
Yeah. No, we had similar experiences in that way, and I know we touched on this when we spoke personally, but we
Yeah.
both grew up in a similar context of our adoptive parents being very visible in our communities. My parents were also leaders within the church, local celebrities in their own way with their other vocations, and it very much felt like I was expected to always uphold and perform and be the version of me they wanted me to be, even in our personal lives. And I don't know if you ever in your teen years like question that with them. I know I was kind of the kid who couldn't help but be a truth teller sometimes, so I'd point things out, and that didn't go over well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So overall, that's my personality. But honestly, if you ask my adoptive mom, the one thing she tells everybody about raising me as a teenager was that I was always respectful to them.
Mm.
And I think that that was something that I learned even from before being adopted is that fawning really,
Yeah.
and there is research to support that fawning is actually much more common in adoptees because it's that survival instinct to keep everybody else happy and you just kind of minimize yourself and just kind of acquiesce to whatever is expected of you because that's what keeps you safe and gets you to the next point of your life.
Yeah. And
And
to just
so
put a pause
yeah.
on, like, so people understand what we mean by fawn,
Mhm.
there are certain trauma responses. Most people are familiar with fight, flight, and freeze, but fawn is its sister, if you will. And tell us what fawn is, Brie.
Yeah, fawning actually gets misrepresented as people pleasing a lot,
Hmm.
but it's actually the difference between people pleasing and fawning is the circumstances under which it's happening. And so it's really that nervous system, if you will, response to trauma or insane stress, overwhelm. Instead of running away, instead of fighting or freezing, you're kind of just making yourself a part of your environment and kind of trying to. Um, Smooth things over until that threat is gone.
Yes, it's like that hypervigilance paired with how can I use people pleasing to
A little
control
bit,
my
yeah.
circumstances to gain like relational safety.
Yeah.
And it's not something we choose to do. It's something our nervous systems kind of take over and do. So that adoptee, everyone knows who's great and okay and well adjusted, like probably experiencing fawn.
Mhm. Yep.
So you were saying that a lot of adoptees statistically experience fawn, and
Yeah.
it's not very well recognized in our
Sorry, it's
homes.
making
And
me do a puzzle piece on TikTok.
oh,
Okay, I think we're good.
we made TikTok happy. Okay,
Yeah.
good. But a lot of adoptees end up in the fawn response.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when we talk about some of the diagnoses that are almost overrepresented in adoptees,
Yeah.
Because adoption is kind of a newer thing to start talking about, even in like the scientific and clinical spaces. People didn't really realize the impact that adoption has on adoptees, really of all kinds, adoptees of all kinds, not just infant adoptees, but adoptees at any point. And because of that, there's a lot of gaps in the research. And so some of it we're having to apply with the lens of what we know about adoption now to the research that we know on things like attachment, that separation trauma, all of those things that we have research on. We're having to kind of use our modern lens and apply it to people now because there isn't really like a subsection of research that tells us about adoption, and we're just starting to kind of get access to that. And even like one of the more widely referenced books about separation trauma was written by an adoptive mother.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people kind of hold that primal wound book as like the holy grail of adoption trauma. But I think we also need to kind of have a little bit of critical thinking about it, because it was still not through an adoptee's perspective or an adoptee's voice. It was still an adoptive parent kind of exploiting their role as an adoptive parent and kind of taking that voice of authority over something that actually didn't impact them the way that it does the adoptee. And so I know there's some really good information that I've even referenced myself, but I think we also have to be honest about where that information came from too, because it's so new when we're talking about how adoptees are impacted by adoption, and talking about all these other systems that come into play, like religion, like we've been talking about, and how adoptees are kind of expected to fall in line with the expectation of them, and that's just not based in the things that we're putting together and finding out about how adoption impacts adoptees.
Yeah, I agree. In the clinical and research realm, we're still in the beginning stages of learning the true extent of the impact, and proving what adoptees are talking about when we share our lived experiences. But I think that puts church spaces in a really good position if they dare take the opportunity to be part of those conversations and to sit with the difficulty of questioning our worldview, the way we've applied scripture, to really use those critical thinking skills and reevaluate, like, are the things we're doing actually as good as we want them to be, or can we make some changes?
Right. And I even think to like something like Celebrate Recovery. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's kind of that church-based support group, really recovery group for people who struggle with some type of like addiction. Can you imagine how powerful those support groups might be if it was geared towards adoptees and supporting their raw, unfiltered experiences and feelings towards adoption instead of trying to silence them? And I don't necessarily think it would be super helpful to kind of make it in that religious like subsystem, but like hosting things like that, hosting conversations about it, and kind of giving that safe space to just kind of be raw with people who theoretically understand. That could be a really important hub for adoptees to kind of get that support, even if they don't have access to a competent therapist, because that's also another thing, is that I think it's 1 in 5 adoptees felt like their therapist was actually adoption competent when they've sought out therapeutic services. And I think it's like 83 or 84% of adoptees at some point seek out therapy from a mental health clinician. And so 1 in 5 being adoption competent for that 83 to 84% of adoptees is just unacceptable. and even in my own program as a marriage and family therapist, I think there was like a mention of adoption as like a factor.
Yeah.
There was no discussion. There was no learning about how that actually impacts that population. Nothing. And I think that is doing a huge disservice because adoptees make up such a substantial amount of the population, not necessarily a majority, but I think there's also a lot of adoptees that we don't even know are adoptees because of the narratives around adoption and people wanting to kind of keep that secret and give the idea that an adopted child is actually biologically theirs when they're not. And that goes down a whole other rabbit hole. But.
Oh, yeah. No, we don't even measure private infant adoptions or private adoptions in general in this country. And it's because the single entity that lobbies and controls the narrative about adoption in our country doesn't bother.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it serves them to know those numbers, but it certainly would serve the truth to know the actual number of adoptees in our country and what those impacts are and how they experience their life course and what their health impacts are looking like as they get to be in their 50s, 60s and beyond,
Right.
It's interesting that you bring up like the paucity of clinical training, because it was the same for me in medical school. We did not talk about the complexity of encountering adopted people when it came to making decisions for medical care. And that's a topic for a whole nother life, but I'll leave it to say that like we wouldn't have touched on what to do with an adopted person when taking their history and physical if I, an adoptee, hadn't raised my hand in class that day and said, what do we do when our person is adopted and they don't know their family history? Is there a certain way we should handle that? Or how do we have that conversation? And the answer was, just check this box, adopted, and do the best you can, And as an adoptee who had just taken DNA tests in order to figure out basic biological information about my own health, that wasn't sufficient,
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot, not just in churches and spiritual spaces, but on the clinical level that we can be doing to serve adoptees with the robust services that we deserve to have in order to have, healthy and full lives.
Absolutely. And even just like quickly on that medical piece too, like I had no contact with my biological family for a couple years after I was adopted. I am in reunion with a small amount of people in my biological family. And that actually ended up being life-saving for one of my biological family members, because after I had given birth to my fourth child, I found out that I had a blood clotting disorder. And it's genetic. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. And so when I found that out for myself, I was able to say, hey, I have this condition. I don't know who it comes from, but maybe this would be relevant for you with some of the health issues that you're having. And luckily, because of some other circumstances with that family member, they were able to get the testing done and they were also positive. And so now that family member is on lifelong medications so that they don't lose their life to this disorder. And I don't know if they ever would have found that out or if they would have still been fighting with some of their health issues, trying to figure out what the cause was if I hadn't known and then been able to kind of reach out to my biological family and say, hey, I have this, it's hereditary. Maybe you have it too. So when adoptees talk about how life-saving their records and medical information is, it's not a joke. It's not some out there idea. It's a real thing. And I think that it's so dangerous to minimize the importance of having access to that information.
Yep. Adoption competence saves lives on multiple levels. Mental health, physical health, spirituality. Yeah, absolutely. So important. And I'm glad that conversations like the one we're in tonight are happening more and more, because that awareness is going to break down barriers, change, reform. If we reform how we talk about things, then we reform how much research we have on them. And we can really make sure that adoptees don't continue to be a minority oppressed people group. Like, just, we deserve having our humanity honored in our space, in all of our community spaces. And that includes spirituality, physical health, all of it. Yeah. Well, should we give, as like a little wrap up, should we give some homework to any non-adoptees that might be listening?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. My homework assignment and something I recommend to so many people is Dr. Gretchen Sisson's work. It's compiled in a book called Relinquish: The Politics and Privilege of American Motherhood, I believe is the subtitle. Gretchen, forgive me if I if I said that backwards, but it's got some really fantastic longitudinal research that Dr. Sisson did about relinquishing mothers and the circumstances around what they go through, and it really dismantles a lot of common adoption propaganda. And I think it should be required reading for anyone who even knows an adoptee, let alone has one in their inner circle.
Yep.
What about you? What's your assignment?
Well, you recommended a book, and I don't want to be like I don't want to seem like a grifter, but I have written 2 books.
Recommend your books, please.
Okay, and I have them here, but I am trying to make more resources. This first one is called Writing Over the Lines. Hopefully you can see it.
Yeah, hold it up a little higher, but yes, it's beautiful.
Oh, okay, yeah. Writing Over the Lines, and this is the first book that I wrote, and it says a book for adoptees, adoptive families, and the clinicians who serve them. And this is really just kind of a mixture of personal experience and things that I wish adoptive families knew, things that I want adoptees to hear, and things that I wish clinicians would keep in mind when they have an adoptee show up in their office needing support. And then the second one is called Consumed, and it is kind of a reckoning, actually, about how the social media age is exploiting adoptees, silencing birth families, and selling the myth of happy adoption. And this one is very much research-based, but I think it's important because with social media, people are exploiting the trauma of adoptees, and I already kind of have a beef with exploiting children online as it is. But when we're adding that extra layer of trauma that adoptees have when they are blasted online by adoptive families, it's a whole other layer of just kind of gross to me, honestly. Yeah. And there is a lot of research that backs how dangerous that is for their mental health and really their physical safety too. I talk a little bit about some of the child blogger kids who have grown up and talked about how unhealthy it was growing up in that environment. And then really just kind of dig into research about how the backlash against adoptees who speak out on social media is so damaging. And I kind of touch on a lot of different topics in there, and even discuss a little bit of that religious piece and how religion is kind of furthering that exploitation of adoptees and what adoption is looking like in the United States. So those are my 2 things, and I have a couple other resources on my PayHip website. But
yes, tell us where to find your website and you online, because I agree, like there's a whole library of resources that Bree's created, y'all. Like, please go take advantage of them. So tell us where to find those and where to find you.
Yeah, so I am most active on TikTok, which my username is Bree in the Making. I'm also on Instagram. I am on Facebook, and I am on YouTube. But TikTok is really the best starting point. And in my bio on TikTok, there is a link to my PayHip, which has the resources that I talked about and should have links to find both of my books if you're interested. So
I love it. And you also had some free resources, which is always like great too.
I'm trying to add some more of those too, because I know I want to be able to make things accessible to people. And I'm hoping to add some more of those pretty soon. So
awesome. And you can find me on most of those other places too. Hi, TikTok, Instagram, Substack. Most of my free resources right now are through my writing on Substack, which is kristinkirkland.substack.com. I'm in the middle of a really lovely, spicy series right now about how adoption actually meets the US and UN definitions of human trafficking. So if anyone wants examples of pushback that adoptees receive, I've got some pretty...
I was going to say, you got some lovely comments.
Some pretty token, like, adoptee pushback comments if you want an example. But I'm on there. I will say I'm at my spiciest on Threads. So if you appreciate that, I'm on Threads. But everywhere I'm Dr. Kirkland, just for ease. That's the username. Well, awesome. Anything else you can think of before we wrap up, Bree?
I don't think so. I have a quote that I put in my Writing Over the Lines book that everybody seems to really resonate with. And it's that grief doesn't require that what you lost was a good thing. It just requires that it was yours. And I think that's something that's really important to remember, is that you don't have to have this wonderful experience with something that you've lost to be allowed to grieve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. That's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks to everyone who joined us on our multiple platforms. I'm really glad we got everything streaming
Yeah, I'm
everywhere.
glad we got it working.
We kind of did a fun troubleshoot moment before we hopped on, but I'm really glad that we were able to like have this chat in multiple spaces online, and I hope we do it again soon.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Everybody have a good night.
Bye.